Hello, everyone. I just wanted to make a few comments about this week's materials, give you some idea of why I chose them, how I think they relate, and you obviously your weekly essay is about what it's about. There's no set topic. You don't have to try to weave all of these things together in a single theme. You can take what you want out of the essay and write about it. Don't have to write about everything, but I'll tell you what I had in mind was a kind of essential question, and that is how do we deal with death? How do we deal with the prospect, especially of our own mortality? And I suppose, in the simplest terms, and I'm a simple man, so I think in simple terms, the question is, can we handle death, especially our own death? Kubler-Ross's incredibly influential stages of acceptance, eventual acceptance of death. It deals both with grief, the death of someone close to us, and with the prospect of our own death. Though I think that it makes quite clear in the article that her theory of the stages of dealing with mortality really began with people who knew that they were dying, and that really is my main interest, I suppose. Certainly, that is what relates to most directly to the excerpt from Epictetus and the scene from this film, The Hit. Really, this question about whether, to what degree, we can rationally accept our own mortality, especially when it's imminent, especially when it's coming soon. I think the most powerful thing that I'm giving you this week, really emotionally, or just very dramatically powerful, is this scene from this film, The Hit, which is a film from the 80s about a British gangster who is in a witness protection program and knows the whole time that eventually he will be killed by his old friends, his criminal friends. The movie is about him being kidnapped and being brought back to the man that he informed on who will kill him. And he displays some very odd behavior for someone who knows this is happening to him, in that he doesn't try to run away. He, in fact, kind of facilitates the whole process, which may seem suicidal, and that's why he's this gangster. This other gangster who's come to get him asks him in this scene, why didn't you make a run for it when you had the chance? And the character, Willie Parker, gives what sounds like a very convincing, or at least very sincere and thoughtful response that death is an inevitability, and the notion of always running from it, always denying it, always putting it off, that it may not make a lot of sense, and that the notion of actually accepting it, maybe even embracing it, and not fighting against it, is, in the largest perspective, maybe the most rational way to approach the subject of immortality. Now, the film, if you ever have a chance to see the film as a whole, I won't say anything more about the film as a whole, except that there are surprises in store, and that thesis, that philosophy of death that the character Willie, the man all dressed in white, played by the great actor Terence Stamp, the philosophy that he espouses gets questioned in the film. And it's a great film about death and about whether or not we can accept death, and use it a lot over the years. The philosophy that this man, who seems to have rationally accepted the inevitability of his own death and denied that it's a bad thing, seems to me to be very close to what is in the excerpt that I gave you from Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, who really espoused a similar philosophy, in that he said in the beginning of his work, the handbook, that it's really important to make a discrimination between the things that we can control in life and the things that we can't control. And according to Epictetus, the things that we can't control turn out to be just about everything that happens in the world. And the things that we can control turn out to be limited to our responses to those events out of our control. Um, for instance, you really can't control in life whether you're rich or poor. But what you can control is how you let being either rich or poor affect you. You can't control death. Death will happen, um, and you can't control when it will happen. Things like that, ultimately, I believe. But you can control whether or not you let death make you miserable or fearful or have anxiety. That is, death is just one of those things that is an inevitability for every human being, and whether it's a good or bad thing is really up to you. That is, if you let it affect you in a negative way, it's a bad thing, but it's only a bad thing, not in itself a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if it has bad effects on you and you control that. Well, what an incredible statement, I think. Um, the notion that death and the prospect of our own death, especially when it becomes imminent again, when it becomes close, that is something that can be rationally controlled, or our response to it can be something that can be rationally controlled, I think is at the very heart of the Kubler-Ross thesis, which is, the stages of grieving and stages of accepting one's own death, which have become really part of our culture. I don't really go into it too much as I have other interests, but they're undeniably important. But and I'm not going to go through the different stages. You can read that. You probably know it better than I do. I'm sure you know it better than I do. I've actually never read her book on death and dying. But at the heart of it is this notion that death does not have to be something that is terrifying and unacceptable. The great thing that Kubler-Ross did for American culture was that she kind of made it okay to talk about death, for doctors to talk about it with patients, for family members to talk about it, for the general popular culture to talk about death, and for dying people to talk about their deaths instead of, it's a very disturbing subject, obviously, but Kubler-Ross kind of gave us a way, whether the article goes into, the flaws, and Kubler-Ross herself never meant her stages of either accepting one's own death or coming to terms with the deaths of another. She never meant that to be gospel. Those are ideas she was throwing out that she thought that she could take out of her actual clinical experience working with people who were dying. But at the very heart of it is this notion that the process, the dying process, is not something that has to terrify us into silence. That we can deal with it, and that a dying person can ultimately reach that stage of acceptance, which is certainly the stage that the character of Willie Parker seemingly gets to in the film, where maybe he's already gone through something like the earlier stages, and we meet him in the film at the stage of acceptance of his mortality. He's no longer trying to get out from under it. So I thought that those are some of the ways in which I think the readings and the film clip relate to each other. I didn't put this out there to say, well, this is the way you should think about it, and there's no other way. No, I put this out there because I thought it was interesting. And, if you have different ideas, if you think that, Epictetus is being a little bit too optimistic, or perhaps a little bit too overly rationalistic in his approach to the way that we think about death, then go ahead and criticize him. If you think that the philosophy that the character in the film espouses about the naturalness, the universality, and the sort of non-terrifying nature of death, if you think that that's all nonsense, then go ahead and write about it, critique it, or if you like it, say why you like it. I just thought it would be interesting at the end of the class. We could have done this at the beginning of the class, frankly, but at the end of the class, to really ask the question about what we've been doing, thinking about death, and really when it comes down to it, is it something that we obviously can talk about it, we've been talking about it, but it's something that we can handle and we can rationally accept.